Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to keep making horror stories. Thank you very much. Let's start the story.
The quaint village of Eldridge, nestled snugly in a valley surrounded by dense forests, had always prided itself on its close-knit community. Everyone knew everyone else, and nothing went unnoticed for long. But in the year of 1923, the village was shaken to its core by the arrival of a mysterious lodger. It all began on a chilly autumn evening when a carriage rolled into the village square. From it stepped a tall, gaunt man clad in a long, dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. His presence was unsettling, his piercing blue eyes seeming to look right through anyone who dared to meet his gaze. He introduced himself as Mr. Alistair Crane and took up residence in the old, long-abandoned Hawthorne house on the outskirts of the village. The villagers were curious about Mr. Crane, but he kept to himself, only venturing out at dusk and returning before dawn. His reclusive nature only fueled the rumors. Some said he was a writer seeking solitude. Others whispered that he was a fugitive. The children, of course, created wild tales of him being a vampire or a ghost. Mrs. Thompson, the owner of the village's only inn, claimed that Mr. Crane had approached her upon his arrival and rented the Hawthorne house for an indefinite period, paying in gold coins that were so old and worn they could barely be identified. She had never seen such coins before and took them to Mr. Finnegan, the village jeweler, who confirmed their authenticity but couldn't place their origin. Despite his mysterious nature, Mr. Crane didn't cause any trouble. He was polite in his interactions, though brief and distant. The villagers began to adjust to his presence, though an air of unease lingered. Strange occurrences began to unfold shortly after his arrival. Livestock disappeared, shadows seemed to move on their own, and eerie whispers were heard in the dead of night. It was Emily Cartwright, a young schoolteacher, who first noticed something peculiar. She had been walking home from the schoolhouse one evening when she saw Mr. Crane standing at the edge of the forest, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He seemed to be speaking, though there was no one around. She couldn't make out the words, but his tone was low and melodic, almost hypnotic. When he turned and saw her, his expression hardened, and without a word, he disappeared into the woods. Disturbed by the encounter, Emily confided in her closest friend, Margaret Weaver. They decided to keep an eye on Mr. Crane, convinced that he was hiding something sinister. The two women began to notice that Mr. Crane's movements were not just odd but almost otherworldly. He appeared to glide rather than walk, and on several occasions, he seemed to vanish into thin air. Their suspicions deepened when they found an ancient book in the village library that spoke of a man named Alistair Crane who had lived over a century ago. According to the book, Crane was an alchemist who had been banished from his homeland for practicing dark magic. His experiments were said to have been so horrific that they invoked the wrath of both the living and the dead. Desperate to uncover the truth, Emily and Margaret decided to search Hawthorne House while Mr. Crane was out. They waited until one evening when they saw him leave and slipped inside. The house was cold and dark, filled with the musty smell of decay. The furniture was covered in dust, and cobwebs draped the corners. It seemed untouched by time, except for the parlor, which was immaculate and filled with strange artifacts. On a large oak table lay an open book, its pages filled with symbols and incantations that made their skin crawl. They found vials of peculiar substances, old maps marked with arcane symbols, and sketches of what appeared to be human-animal hybrids. The walls were adorned with portraits of solemn-faced individuals, their eyes hauntingly lifelike. In the center of the room stood a large mirror, its surface rippling like water. As they approached, a chill ran down their spines. Emily felt a strange compulsion to touch the mirror, but Margaret pulled her back, her face pale with fear. They knew they had to leave, but just as they turned to go, they heard the door creak open. Mr. Crane stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said softly, his voice carrying an icy edge. "There are things in this world best left undiscovered." Terrified, the women fled the house, vowing never to speak of what they had seen. But the events had already set something in motion. That night, the village was rocked by a series of violent storms, unlike anything they had ever experienced. Trees were uprooted, houses were damaged, and livestock was found mutilated. The villagers, now thoroughly unnerved, demanded answers. They gathered outside Hawthorne House, torches in hand, ready to confront Mr. Crane. But as they approached, the house seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and an unearthly wail echoed through the night. Suddenly, the door of the house flew open, and Mr. Crane stepped out. He raised his hand, and the crowd froze in place. "You seek answers," he intoned, his voice resonating with power. "But know this, there are forces at work beyond your comprehension. Leave now or face the consequences." Defiant, the village elder, Mr. Harrington, stepped forward. "We will not be threatened," he declared. "We demand to know who you are and what you want." Mr. Crane's eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "I am but a traveler seeking refuge," he replied. "But you have disturbed ancient powers that even I cannot control. Your lives are now forfeit." With those words, a darkness spread from the house, engulfing the villagers. Panic ensued as they tried to flee, but the shadows were relentless, swallowing them whole. Emily and Margaret, having followed the crowd, watched in horror from a distance as their friends and neighbors were consumed. Desperate, they ran to the church, hoping for sanctuary. Father O'Malley, the village priest, met them at the door. "What has happened?" he asked, seeing the terror in their eyes. "It's Mr. Crane," Emily gasped. "He's not human. He's brought something terrible with him." Father O'Malley led them inside and locked the doors. "We must pray," he said gravely. "Only faith can protect us now." The three of them knelt before the altar, reciting prayers as the shadows outside writhed and screamed. The church trembled, but the darkness could not penetrate its sacred walls. As dawn approached, the wails subsided, and the first light of day broke the curse. When they emerged, they found the village in ruins. The bodies of their friends and neighbors lay lifeless, drained of all color and vitality. Hawthorne House had vanished, leaving only a scorched patch of earth where it once stood. In the weeks that followed, the survivors rebuilt their homes, but the village was never the same. The memory of Mr. Crane and the horrors he brought with him lingered like a dark stain. Emily and Margaret, forever changed by their ordeal, dedicated their lives to understanding what had happened. They discovered that Mr. Crane had been an immortal, bound to wander the earth and perform dark rituals to sustain his existence. Though they never found him again, they knew he was out there, a specter of death and despair, and they warned anyone who would listen, "Beware the mysterious lodger, for his presence heralds doom."